You thought I was done embarrassing Raquel. I am not, because if you would have watched C-SPAN last spring, you would have seen Raquel in her little page uniform um, walking questions from senators, some of the 100 most powerful people in the country, all the way up to the front of the U.S. Senate chamber to be read to the witness in the first impeachment trial. So pretty cool. Now, conviction by the Senate after the trial has been held and the final vote is is 2/3. And we talked about that today, right? Which 2/3 of 100 is 66.6 or 67 votes. So it requires 66 senators to vote to convict, even as a simple majority in the House can bring impeachment charges. So you need to be careful with this because the word impeach can be used two different ways. Donald Trump was impeached twice, but he was not convicted of or actually impeached um, either times because he was found innocent in his Senate trial. And that is obviously a bit confusing. Now, prior to Donald Trump, only two presidents had actually been impeached. One was Andrew Garfield, the person who followed Lincoln, and the other one was, I should know this. Good Lord. I'm blanking. Nixon was actually never impeached because Nixon resigned when it became clear that he was not only going to be impeached, but he was going to be convicted. He had counted the votes just as well as anybody else. Um, Obviously, Donald Trump is adding to that. Oh, there it is. Johnson, Clinton, come on. Okay, so not Garfield. Johnson was after Lincoln. You can tell I've never really been an American history guy. Neither were convicted in the Senate. Both were impeached by the House. Donald J. Trump would be the third president, although he is famously the only president to have been impeached twice. Um, and as I already said that. Okay, a couple pictures. We might watch the movie The Post. In fact, I will offer it as extra credit. When we get, well, we've already covered the media unit. It is a wonderful movie. It's called The Post. If you do watch it, let me know. I have an extra credit assignment available to it, and that will add extra points in your summative assessment category. So I don't offer it much. You have The West Wing. Now you have The Post, a really fantastic movie about Watergate and, or no, not Watergate, but the Pentagon Papers, as we head into our civil liberties unit. Okay, so here are the traditionally, you don't need to copy these down, but stay with me. Here are the traditionally um, constitutionally held reasons or grounds for impeachment. Now, this is clarified language that has been built through precedent, legal precedent over years, but you can't really find it in the Constitution. The Constitution, as I said, is very vague in the language. High crimes, misdemeanors, and treason. Impeachable behavior does not have to be a crime. For example, if a president refused to work or chose to invade a country solely to increase his public support, his actions would be grounds for impeachment as high crimes, the abstract way of that, even though they would not necessarily violate the law. The offense should be grave. It should be serious. It should be like not something like, oh, how dare he? We make a mountain out of a molehill, if you will. For example, a poker game in the White House, even though it may violate the law, would not be an impeachable offense because it's minor. You cannot impeach somebody for a matter of policy disagreement. Andrew Johnson was impeached in 1868 and survived conviction by only one vote. But the real issue was that he disagreed with Congress over the policy of Reconstruction. Johnson's impeachment is widely viewed as an abuse of impeachment power historically, and that it was not a legitimate impeachment. And then lastly, impeachment is an inherently political process. And this was talked about in the Trump first trial, especially like, this is a political escapade. And it's like, well, yeah, impeachment is an inherently political process. The grounds for impeachment are ultimately whatever Congress decides they are, because the Constitution assigns to politicians or political judgment. So, how has the executive power changed since the founding of our country? This is a huge one that the College Board loves to focus on because the evolution of executive power has been one of the great trends in American government. Um, Question: which branch of the United States government did Congress originally intend to be the most robust, the strongest of the three branches of? Was it the president? Was it Congress? Or was it the courts? Correct answer? It was Congress, right? Congress was originally seen by the founding fathers as supposed to be the kind of voice of the people. If you hear a baby whining right now, it's because I'm lecturing with a 3-month old strapped to my chest. I apologize for it, but it is what we do. Continuing, um, we look at the progression of this um, executive power. Apologize for how messy this has been. I've been trying to lecture without kind of a quiet, dedicated space. So um, hashtag COVID learning. So anyway, picking up, we talked about how executive power has really grown because at the time of founding, right, the legislative branch was seen by the founders as being the most powerful branch of government, and the founders were really leery of a strong executive with King George on their mind. Um, and so they created within the Constitution a number of provisions that would limit and kind of neuter slash weaken the executive. The executive only had 4-year terms. Um, they were limited in their reelection. Washington set the precedent early that he would stop after 2. There were provisions for impeachment, and that there were very little expressed or enumerated powers specifically given to the executive. The number of powers specifically given to Congress will far um, out or surpass those given to the executive. And that the powers, the really dangerous powers, right, the power to impeach, the power to go to war, the power to create new taxes, all of these powers were given to other branches that were seen as more deliberative, right, or deliberate, and more kind of reflective of the will of the people. Whereas, the power in the hands of a single executive was a concern, right? And so this um, has obviously changed over the years. And we've now gotten to a place in American government where the executive branch is pretty, without question, the most powerful branch in our government. And when you kind of dissect how the executive branch has grown to be the most powerful when it was definitely not intended to, we have to look at some historical forces that have brought this. Number one, in 1776 or 1781, when the Constitution was passed, and um, America was not what it is today. America's unquestioned superpower in the world today, and its role in not just kind of acting as a advocate for freedom and looking like towards our interests and our allies and being a strong source of power in the world has necessitated um, kind of a more active and engaged executive, right? These decisions for American political and defense movements in the world can't really be made by Congress in an official manner or an efficient manner. We've also seen technology developments that have greatly sped up American role. We obviously the internet comes to mind, but so too do transportation increases, so too do weaponry and the atomic bomb, for example, right? The president is the one who carries the nuclear codes. It's called the nuclear football. Maybe you've heard this story, right? That constitutionally somebody, or not constitutionally, but constitutional statute, the president is accompanied on every single trip and every single minute of the day. There is somebody within a minute of his presence who has a briefcase handcuffed to their wrist in which are the nuclear codes to launch nuclear weapons. Whether that's the president asleep in the West Wing and the person stationed right outside their door, or that's a campaign trip to Iowa where the person is backstage. Um, the president is the one who gets to make that calls, right? And so these technology developments have greatly expanded the power of the president as being able to respond to global threats that were far greater than what the founders envisioned or had to deal with in the 18th century. But then we also start to see that presidential power has expanded and built through precedent, right? Meaning that every time the president does something and is allowed to do it and gets away with it, there is a precedent set that they are therefore allowed to do it. If a president tries something and then gets, their hand slapped and says, "Bad, president, bad, that's too far," then, that power is, that limitation is precedent set in the other direction. But the fact of the matter is that presidents have been increasingly allowed to do things as Congress has sort of given away their constitutionally endowed powers, whether we would argue because of fear and fear of not getting elected, or fear of fundraising, or fear of political viability. Um, we see that as we trace back American presidential power, we also see some clear trends that have emerged in American history, which, in the 1950s and 60s, we really as a country valued incredibly strong presidents. This is not surprising because in the 1950s and 60s, we were dealing with the onslaught of the Cold War, right? And a rising Soviet Union that threatened American way of life and American security. And, these presidents like Dwight Eisenhower, the head of Allied command in World War II, who is seen as being a pillar of strength. And then, we look at Truman, and we look at, um, you know, Kennedy, right? These presidents were seen, and LBJ as the strong presidents were the way to keep America's position um, current, and to make sure that our enemies' positions were countered. But then we also saw in the late 60s and early 70s that the Watergate and Vietnam War dramatically turned the tide, and American opinion went against these strong leaders. We saw that when you give the president too much power, like with LBJ and Nixon with Vietnam, that America's, involvement in conflicts around the world basically happened when we never even declared war, right? Like, you learned this in US history last year. America never declared war in Vietnam. It was just American presidents using their commander in chief powers to send troops to war, and Congress not checking them on that. And so after these scandals, American opinion turned pretty strongly against these leaders. And, historians would look at the forthcoming presidents that followed Nixon as being examples of a much more diminutive executive, like Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter would be viewed as weak, right? And not a really strong executive presence in the world. Reagan would be looked at as kind of like a middle ground. He postured and positioned himself as a strong executive oftentimes, but the fact of the matter is he was often thwarted by a Democratic Congress that didn't allow him to enact much of what he wanted, right? And so we have seen this like seesaw. Um, Now, this has been the same for George H.W. Bush, but we have seen in recent years kind of a movement back towards the 50s and 60s president, where, post 9/11 and the war on terror, and this feeling like we are under assault by Islamic extremism and people who, take issue with the American way of life, um, basically pushed American sensibility in the other direction. And suddenly we've had a president with George W. Bush and, Barack Obama, that were really pillars of a strong executive, and used a lot of executive orders, and issued a lot of pretty strong commands in order to enact their vision. So, I guess what I'm saying is that the role of the executive changes over time, and also changes in line with kind of where our culture is at and where society is at that point, right? In the new times of the Cold War, we wanted strong, but then when we that went too strong, like in Vietnam, we suddenly wanted weaker. And then, the Twin Towers fell, and suddenly we want strong again. And maybe after Donald Trump, we want weaker again. So, this is kind of that seesaw effect that happens historically that I would like you guys to pay attention to. And that's it for today. I will see you in class on Friday.